The Vikings' Survival Blueprint. The year is 793 AD, and the quiet morning mist hangs low over the North Sea as monks move silently through the stone halls of Lindisfarne. Nothing feels unusual, nothing feels dangerous. Then shapes appear on the horizon, long and narrow, cutting through the water like blades. Within minutes, the calm is shattered by the sound of boots on sand, shields slamming, and war cries echoing against the monastery walls. The raid would shock Europe and mark the beginning of the Viking Age. But the real story of the Vikings doesn't start with violence. It starts with survival. Because the truth is, the Vikings didn't become powerful because they loved war. They became powerful because they had no choice but to master one of the harshest environments on Earth. Scandinavia was not a forgiving homeland. Winters stretched endlessly, sunlight disappeared for months, and the soil was thin, rocky, and often useless for farming. For most medieval societies, land like this meant poverty, hunger, and eventual collapse. Yet somehow, the Norse people didn't just survive there. They built thriving communities, expanded across oceans, and created a civilization strong enough to reshape Europe. To understand how they did it, you have to imagine growing up in a place where every winter could kill you. Food wasn't just something you ate, it was something you fought for months in advance. Every summer became a race against time. Crops had to be planted and harvested quickly before the first frost. Fish had to be caught in enormous quantities while the seas were navigable. Animals had to be bred, fed, and protected so they could survive the freezing darkness ahead. Failure didn't mean inconvenience, it meant starvation. Most societies facing conditions like this stayed small and isolated, trapped by geography and climate. The Vikings responded differently. Instead of surrendering to nature, they studied it. They experimented constantly, learning through trial, error, and observation. Over generations, this mindset created something extraordinary, a culture built around practical knowledge, adaptation, and long-term survival planning. One of their greatest advantages came from how they treated farming. While much of medieval Europe relied heavily on single-crop harvests, Viking farmers diversified everything. They learned quickly that barley and rye matured faster in cold climates than wheat. These hardy grains became the backbone of their food supply, not because they tasted better, but because they were reliable. Reliability meant survival. Survival meant stability. They also refined crop rotation in ways uniquely suited to northern conditions. Fields weren't simply planted and abandoned. Land was divided, rested, and replenished deliberately. Legumes were planted to restore soil nutrients, and grazing animals were rotated across pastures to naturally fertilize the ground. It wasn't scientific in the modern sense, but it was deeply systematic. Viking farmers paid attention to what worked, remembered it, and passed that knowledge forward. Livestock became even more important than crops. In many parts of Europe, animals were slaughtered quickly for meat. Vikings saw animals as long-term investments. A cow wasn't just food, it was milk every day, cheese for storage, hides for clothing, and calves for the future. Sheep produced wool that could be spun into warm clothing essential for northern winters. Goats survived on rough terrain and provided both milk and meat. Keeping animals alive through winter became a strategic priority, not a luxury. This led to innovations in barn construction and winter preparation. Viking barns were built low and insulated, sometimes even connected to homes so body heat from animals helped warm living spaces. During summer, families worked relentlessly to cut and dry hay, storing enormous reserves to feed livestock once snow buried the fields. These hay stores weren't optional, they were life insurance. But growing food and raising animals solved only half the problem. The real challenge was making food last. Winter in Scandinavia could stretch for 6 or even 8 months. Without preservation, even the best harvest would disappear long before spring. This is where Viking ingenuity truly changed their destiny. Salting became one of their most powerful tools. Fish, especially cod and herring, were caught in vast numbers during peak seasons. They were cleaned, layered in salt, and sealed in barrels. The salt pulled moisture from the flesh and prevented bacteria from growing, allowing the fish to last for months. Entire communities depended on these salted reserves. A full barrel of preserved fish meant security, an empty one meant fear. Smoking was another essential method. Meat and fish were hung above slow-burning fires fueled by woods like birch or oak. The smoke dried the food while coating it with compounds that slowed decay. Smoked food could be stored in cool spaces and eaten deep into winter. Over time, smoked fish even became a trade commodity, valued far beyond Scandinavia. Dairy preservation added another layer of resilience. Fresh milk spoiled quickly, but Vikings transformed it into cheese, butter, and fermented products that could last far longer. Specialized buildings were sometimes used for cheese production, where temperature and airflow were controlled as carefully as possible. These weren't random techniques, they were deliberate systems refined over generations. With farming stabilized and food secured, Viking communities achieved something rare in harsh climates: surplus. And surplus changes everything. When you're no longer fighting for your next meal, you can think about trade, travel, and expansion. That's when the sea stopped being a barrier and became an opportunity. The Vikings didn't invent boats, but they perfected ships in ways the medieval world had never seen. Their longships were sleek, flexible, and astonishingly versatile. Unlike heavier European vessels, Viking ships had shallow drafts, allowing them to sail in deep ocean water one day and glide up shallow rivers the next. They could land directly on beaches without needing harbors, making them ideal for exploration, trade, and yes, raids. The construction method was revolutionary. Overlapping wooden planks created hulls that flexed with the waves instead of cracking against them. Seams were sealed with fibers and pine tar, creating vessels strong enough to cross the North Atlantic, yet light enough to be dragged across land between rivers. This combination of strength and mobility gave the Vikings access to routes no one else could use. But even the greatest ship is useless without navigation, and here the Vikings demonstrated a different kind of intelligence entirely. They didn't rely on compasses or detailed maps. Instead, they learned to read the natural world with extraordinary precision. They studied ocean swells, understanding that waves often carried the memory of distant storms and consistent wind patterns. Even when fog covered the sky, experienced sailors could maintain direction by feeling how the ship moved beneath them. They watched birds, knowing certain species rarely strayed far from land. A sudden increase in seabirds could signal a nearby coastline long before it appeared. At night, the stars became guides. The North Star's height above the horizon offered clues about latitude. The sun's path across the sky shifted with the seasons, providing orientation during long voyages. Some historians even believe Vikings used special crystals, often called sunstones, to detect the sun's position through cloud cover by observing polarized light. Whether used widely or rarely, the idea reflects a culture constantly searching for practical solutions. This mastery of sea travel allowed Vikings to do something extraordinary for their time. They didn't just hug coastlines, they crossed open ocean. By the late 9th century, they had settled Iceland. By the late 10th century, they reached Greenland, establishing farms in its narrow, habitable coastal strips. Around the year 1000, Norse explorers reached North America, building a short-lived settlement known today through archaeological remains. These journeys weren't random acts of bravery, they were calculated expansions supported by agricultural planning, preservation knowledge, and ship technology. Every successful voyage reinforced their survival blueprint: find land, study its climate, adapt farming methods, preserve food, establish trade routes, share knowledge, repeat. Back home, Viking society reinforced this system culturally. Skills were learned through apprenticeship. Shipbuilders trained young workers for years, passing down techniques plank by plank. Farmers taught children how to read weather patterns, soil conditions, and animal behavior. Storytelling preserved navigation routes and settlement knowledge, embedding practical lessons into sagas and oral traditions. Trade networks tied everything together. Viking merchants connected Scandinavia to the British Isles, continental Europe, the Middle East, and beyond. Silver from Islamic regions, furs from the north, timber, iron, wool, and preserved foods all moved along these routes. Trade didn't just bring wealth, it spread ideas. New tools, farming methods, and building techniques flowed back into Viking communities, constantly upgrading their survival system. By now, the Viking world wasn't just enduring harsh conditions, it was thriving because of them. Hardship had forced innovation, innovation had created resilience, resilience had created expansion, and expansion changed how the rest of Europe saw them. To frightened coastal villages, Viking ships looked like unstoppable forces of chaos. Chronicles painted them as savage raiders appearing from nowhere, but those same ships also carried traders, settlers, craftsmen, and families searching for opportunity. The raids were real, but they were only one part of a much larger story, a civilization powered not by destruction, but by adaptation. The Viking advantage wasn't a single invention or moment of brilliance, it was the combination of many small, practical insights stacked together over centuries. Smart farming supported reliable food supplies supported population growth supported exploration and trade, exploration brought resources and knowledge strengthened the entire system. This interconnected survival blueprint turned a frozen, unforgiving homeland into the launch point for one of history's most influential expansions. And the most remarkable part is that none of it depended on advanced science, universities, or written textbooks. It depended on observation, memory, and a culture that valued useful knowledge above all else. In a world where winter could erase entire communities, the Vikings built a society designed to outlast it. And they were just getting started. Expansion, trade, and the hidden power behind Viking success. Once the Viking survival system was strong enough at home, something unexpected happened. Survival stopped being their only goal. Security created confidence, and confidence created ambition. The same knowledge that kept families alive through brutal winters now pushed them outward into the wider world. At first, the sea offered simple opportunities. Nearby coasts meant new fishing grounds, seasonal camps, and trading contact with distant villages. But each successful journey proved something bigger. The ocean wasn't a wall, it was a highway. The Viking mindset toward exploration was practical, not romantic. They didn't sail just to discover. They sailed because expanding their reach reduced risk at home. If one harvest failed, trade could supply grain. If local resources ran thin, new territories could provide timber, fish, or grazing land. Exploration became a survival strategy on a continental scale. This is why Viking voyages were rarely reckless. They were organized, often seasonal, and built on accumulated knowledge. Sailors memorized routes, landmarks, currents, and safe landing points. Returning crews shared what they learned, gradually building mental maps of enormous regions. Over time, these shared experiences formed one of the most effective travel networks of the medieval world. Trade quickly became the engine powering this expansion. Viking merchants moved goods across astonishing distances, linking the cold North Atlantic to the markets of Europe and even the Middle East. Furs, walrus ivory, timber, iron, amber, and preserved fish flowed outward from northern lands. In return came silver coins, glassware, spices, jewelry, and new tools. Silver, in particular, transformed Viking economies. Unlike barter systems common elsewhere, silver allowed wealth to be stored, divided, and transported easily. Hoards buried across Scandinavia revealed just how deeply trade reshaped their society. Wealth from distant markets didn't just enrich chiefs and traders, it funded ships, supported settlements, and encouraged further voyages, feeding the cycle of expansion. Trade routes also doubled as information highways. A merchant returning from distant lands didn't just bring goods, he brought stories, techniques, and observations. Maybe he saw a new kind of plow in England. Maybe he learned improved metalworking methods from continental craftsmen. Maybe he heard about fertile land across the sea. Each piece of information strengthened the Viking system back home. This constant flow of knowledge made Viking society unusually adaptive. Instead of clinging to tradition blindly, they absorbed what worked. Foreign tools were copied, useful farming techniques were modified for northern climates. Ship designs improved as builders experimented with size, sail shapes, and hull flexibility. Innovation wasn't a rare event, it was a continuous process. As their confidence at sea grew, Vikings didn't just visit foreign lands, they settled them. Iceland became one of the first major examples. Settlers arrived in the late 9th century and found a rugged but livable island. The land was volcanic, the climate cold, and the growing season short, but Vikings already understood how to manage such conditions. They established farms, grazing systems, and fishing networks almost immediately. Within decades, Iceland had a functioning society with laws, assemblies, and trade links back to Scandinavia and beyond. Greenland pushed their knowledge even further. When Eric the Red led settlers there in the late 10th century, survival was far from guaranteed. The habitable land was limited to narrow coastal strips, and winters were harsher than anything in Iceland. Yet the settlers applied the same blueprint: livestock-focused farming, hay storage, preserved food reserves, and strong trade connections. They exported walrus ivory and hides, receiving iron and timber in return. For generations, these settlements endured in conditions most Europeans would have considered impossible. Even their journey to North America shows the same pattern. Norse explorers didn't just land and leave. Archaeological evidence shows they built structures, repaired ships, and attempted to harvest local resources. Though the settlement didn't last permanently, the attempt itself proves their expansion model: explore, evaluate resources, attempt settlement, and integrate into the trade network if viable. But Viking success wasn't built only on ships and settlements. Their social structure quietly supported everything. Leadership in Viking communities depended heavily on reputation and results. A successful leader wasn't just a warrior. He was someone who could organize expeditions, manage trade relationships, distribute resources fairly, and ensure survival during hard winters. Authority was reinforced through assemblies where disputes were settled and laws agreed upon, creating a surprising level of social stability for a society often remembered only for raids. Family units were equally important. Farms functioned as production centers where everyone contributed. Men, women, and children all played roles in food production, textile work, maintenance, and preparation for winter. Women often controlled household resources and storage, meaning the success of preservation systems depended heavily on their expertise. A well-managed household could mean the difference between comfort and starvation. Craft specialization added another layer of strength. Shipbuilders, blacksmiths, weavers, carpenters, and navigators developed deep expertise in their fields. These skills weren't isolated, they supported each other. Better iron tools improved farming efficiency. Better ships improved trade and exploration. Better textiles meant warmer clothing and sails. Each craft strengthened the entire system. Religion and belief systems also played a subtle but powerful role. Norse mythology emphasized courage, endurance, and preparation for inevitable hardship. The idea that struggle was unavoidable but manageable reinforced their cultural acceptance of planning and resilience. Instead of expecting safety, Viking culture expected challenges and rewarded those who prepared for them. Meanwhile, Europe often misunderstood what made Vikings effective. Monks writing chronicles saw the sudden raids and recorded fear and destruction. They didn't see the months of preparation behind each voyage, the agricultural planning funding each ship, or the trade networks sustaining each expedition. To outsiders, Vikings seemed like a violent storm appearing from nowhere. In reality, they were the product of one of the most organized survival systems of their time. As Viking influence spread, they didn't just take resources. They integrated into local societies. In parts of England and France, Viking settlers farmed land, married into local populations, and adopted elements of Christianity and European governance. Over generations, these communities blended cultures, creating new political and economic centers that combined Viking mobility with European infrastructure. This blending marked the gradual transformation of the Viking Age. Raids became less central as trade, settlement, and political integration grew more profitable. Scandinavian kingdoms consolidated power, and former raiders became rulers, merchants, and landowners. The survival blueprint that began in frozen northern farms had evolved into a framework for state building. By the 11th century, Scandinavia was no longer a distant, struggling frontier. It was a connected, economically active region shaping European politics and commerce. The same knowledge system that once ensured winter survival now supported armies, cities, and international trade. Yet the foundation never changed. Food security still mattered. Shipbuilding skills still mattered. Navigation knowledge still mattered. Cultural respect for practical expertise still mattered. These basics continued to support Scandinavian strength long after the era of famous raids had faded. What makes the Viking story so compelling isn't just how far they traveled or how fiercely they fought. It's how methodically they built a civilization capable of adapting to almost any environment they encountered. Harsh climates didn't stop them. Distance didn't stop them. Uncertainty didn't stop them. Each challenge simply became another problem to study, understand, and solve. By turning survival into a system and knowledge into their greatest resource, the Vikings created something far more enduring than a reputation for warfare. They created momentum, and that momentum would shape their legacy in ways the medieval world could never have predicted. Legacy, lessons, and why the Viking blueprint still matters. By the time the Viking Age began to fade in the 11th century, something remarkable had already happened. The people once feared as unpredictable raiders had quietly transformed into traders, settlers, rulers, and architects of emerging European powers. Their ships still sailed, their farms still produced, and their trade routes still connected continents. But their greatest achievement wasn't the land they reached, it was the system they built. Because when you strip away the myths, the helmets, and the battle stories, Viking success comes down to one simple truth. They treated survival as a skill that could be learned, improved, and passed on. In a world where most societies reacted to crisis, the Vikings prepared for it. Where others depended on luck, they depended on planning. Where others feared harsh environments, they studied them until those environments became manageable. Think about what that meant in daily life. A Viking farmer didn't assume the harvest would succeed. He planned for failure and stored enough food to survive it. A sailor didn't trust the sea to stay calm. He learned to read winds, waves, birds, and stars so he could navigate when conditions turned dangerous. A shipbuilder didn't copy old designs blindly. He adjusted them, improving flexibility, speed, and durability with each new vessel. This constant mindset of preparation created resilience not just in individuals, but in the entire society. Resilience meant fewer catastrophic collapses. It meant communities could recover faster from bad winters or failed crops. It meant population could grow steadily instead of fluctuating wildly with each environmental disaster. And steady population growth meant more workers, more sailors, more traders, and more innovation. Over generations, this stability compounded. Scandinavian regions that were once marginal became organized kingdoms. Trade wealth funded churches, towns, and infrastructure. Former Viking territories in England, Ireland, France, and Eastern Europe evolved into influential political centers. Even as the raiding era ended, the cultural emphasis on adaptability and practical knowledge continued shaping these societies. The Vikings didn't disappear, they evolved. Their language blended into local dialects. Their trade routes became permanent commercial arteries. Their shipbuilding techniques influenced later European naval design. Their legal assemblies inspired local governance traditions in some regions, and their exploratory spirit helped normalize the idea that oceans could connect worlds instead of separating them. Perhaps the most powerful part of their legacy, though, is the invisible one, the mindset. The Viking approach to life assumed that nature was harsh, resources were limited, and survival required cooperation, observation, and constant learning. It wasn't about heroism in single dramatic moments. It was about thousands of small, smart decisions repeated every year. Plant the crops that actually grow in your climate. Preserve more food than you think you'll need. Build tools strong enough for worst-case conditions. Share knowledge so the next generation starts ahead of you. Expand your opportunities so one failure never destroys everything. This wasn't written in textbooks, it was embedded in culture. And that's why their story still resonates today. Modern audiences often look at Vikings and see adventure. Long ships on open seas, distant lands, legendary battles. But beneath that cinematic image lies something more relatable and more relevant. The Vikings succeeded because they mastered adaptability in an uncertain world. They didn't control the climate. They didn't control geography. They didn't control the dangers waiting beyond the horizon. What they controlled was how they responded. That lesson feels surprisingly modern. Today, the challenges are different, but the principle is the same. Societies and individuals thrive when they build systems instead of relying on luck, when they diversify resources instead of depending on one fragile source, when they learn continuously instead of assuming yesterday's solutions will work forever. The Viking survival blueprint wasn't really about ships or swords. It was about understanding that knowledge compounds. Every skill learned, every mistake remembered, every improvement shared strengthens the future. Imagine standing on a cold Scandinavian shore 1,000 years ago, watching a longship disappear into the mist. From the outside, it might look like a reckless gamble against an unforgiving sea. But inside that ship would be sailors carrying preserved food, navigational knowledge, tested ship designs, and a culture that believed preparation beats fear. That combination is what allowed them to cross oceans that others thought uncrossable. It's what allowed them to farm land others thought unusable. It's what allowed them to survive winters others thought unsurvivable. And ultimately, it's what allowed them to leave a legacy far greater than their reputation for raids. Because history doesn't remember the Vikings simply for where they went. It remembers them because they proved something timeless. Harsh conditions don't automatically destroy a society. Sometimes they forge one strong enough to change the world. So the next time you hear the word Viking, don't just picture warriors charging onto distant shores. Picture the farmers planning months ahead for winter. The shipbuilders refining each plank for strength and flexibility. The navigators reading the sky and sea like a living map. Picture a culture built on learning, adapting, and preparing. That's the real story behind why they thrived where others starved. And if you found this story fascinating, make sure to subscribe, because there are many more hidden histories and forgotten survival secrets waiting to be uncovered. The past isn't just about what happened, it's about what we can still learn from it today.